Today we will discuss viruses. Viruses are measured in nanometers. When we talked about bacteria, bacteria were measured in micrometers. If you recall, a micrometer was 1/1,000,000th of a meter. A nanometer is 1,000 times smaller than a micrometer. So 1 nanometer is 1/1000,000th of a meter. So viruses are 1,000 times smaller than a bacterium. Viruses are incredibly unique and intriguing. Viruses are just pieces of nucleic acid, which is DNA, right? Nucleic acid, DNA or RNA, with a protein coat. So it has genetic information, but it's not a cell. It's not, that standard that we think of when we talk about living things. For this course, we are not going to consider viruses living because we've been talking about the properties of life, and viruses do not fulfill several of those properties. They're missing key characteristics like metabolic activities. They don't have any organelles or cytoplasm. They don't have that cellular organization. They can't maintain homeostasis. They can't reproduce on their own. So we, in this class, are not going to consider viruses living. There is a debate within the scientific community, however, whether or not we should consider them living. You may be wondering then, why, if we are in biology, the study of life, are we studying about something we're not going to consider living? And hopefully you are able to understand that viruses, while we're not going to consider them living, are going to have huge effects on living things. Viruses, in fact, can cause illness in any living thing. Viruses can infect bacteria, they can infect protista, fungi, plants, and animals. Any living thing is susceptible to coming down with a viral illness. The structure of a virus is pretty simple. All viruses have nucleic acid, and you can see here that can either be RNA or DNA. So they're going to have some type of genetic material, and then that material is going to be enclosed in a capsid, which is basically just a protein that houses that genetic information, and it's going to surround that nucleic acid. Some of them have an envelope, which is kind of like a membrane that covers that capsid, but not all of them have to. As you can see here, there are different types of viral structures, and on your note worksheet, there are even more below this. Viruses can come in many different forms. There are kind of the circular spherical ones. There's more of like a column type shape. There are the little bacteriophages that kind of look like robots, but a bacteriophage is kind of a misnomer. It makes you think it's a bacteria by what its name is, when in fact it's a virus that infects bacteria. So that is why it's called a bacteriophage. So a bacteriophage is a virus that infects bacteria, but it's still a virus. Since viruses are not considered living, we are going to use the word replicate instead of reproduce. Viruses replicate. They cannot reproduce. They cannot make more of their own kind. They require a host cell to replicate and make more of them. The way that viruses replicate is by identifying receptors, which, if you recall, are proteins on the outside of the cell membrane, and the virus fakes out those receptors to think that it's something okay to let in. The cell lets in the virus particle, or the DNA gets injected into that host cell, and then from there on it goes into one of two cycles: the lytic or lytic cycle, or the lysogenic cycle. So lytic and lytic, you could say either or, is a shorter cycle that results in the destruction of the host cell. The lysogenic cycle is a longer cycle that's not going to typically destroy the cell. And we will look at what these look like on the next slide. Here we have a visual of what these two virus cycles look like. Starting at number 1 where it says start, you can see that the virus, this is a bacteriophage, so that virus is going to bind to the outside of that cell. It's going to inject its DNA into the host cell. If it's going into the lytic cycle, it goes off to the left here, where the DNA of the host is broken down, and instead the virus's DNA is replicated by the bacterium. Then those virus particles are assembled and new viruses are formed, where they then burst that cell, so they just destroy the cell, and then they move on to other cells to start the whole process again. The virus can also be lysogenic, which is when the virus will inject its DNA into the host cell, and that DNA will become a part of the host's DNA. You can see in step 3 here that DNA is integrating itself into that bacterial chromosome. So whether it's bacteria or animal or plant, it will become a part of that DNA or genetic information of the host. And then as that host cell replicates, it replicates the viral DNA with it. Occasionally, the viral DNA will come out of the host cell and will then go back into the lytic cycle. This is true with herpes and HIV. People with herpes and HIV don't typically show symptoms or have symptoms all the time. If you've ever had a cold sore, you don't have cold sores every day, always. They show up occasionally when that virus decides to come out of the host cell and become a part of the lytic cycle. This is also true of HIV, which is why if a person ever thinks that they may have been exposed to HIV, it is really important that they get tested, because it's a lysogenic virus. It will just be a part of that person's cells, and they may not show symptoms for years before all of a sudden they're showing symptoms of HIV. So it's really important to get tested if you consider or if you're considering that you might have it. Here are just a few illnesses that are caused by viral diseases. The flu, we are very familiar with. They come out with a vaccine every year to target a couple of strains of the flu, but there are thousands of strains of the flu, and so even if you get the flu shot, you still may come down with the flu. It will just be a different strain. HIV/AIDS, I mentioned. Ebola is that kind of redder virus there in the middle. Marburg is a sister virus of Ebola. Smallpox, you can see, is affected this hand at the bottom. Those are the little pox that occur with smallpox. So these are just a few diseases that are caused by viruses. This last slide is about all disease transmission. So this is no matter if it's bacterial, viral, protist, or fungus. These are the 5 ways that diseases can spread from person to person. And so when a virus or bacterium is spread from person to person, they're considered contagious. The first is direct contact. So this is a host coming into contact with another host. This can be through kissing, handshakes, animal insect bites, sexual contact, etc. The second is through the air. So if you breathe out particles and somebody else breathes them in, that is air transmission. Contaminated food would be eating something like raw chicken or meat that has bacterial growth in it and you get sick. Contaminated water is going to be drinking water that contains those. This is one of the really important reasons that we are drinking tap water and don't drink from clear rivers and streams, because even though it might look clean, there are microbes that live in there and they can make you sick. And the second one is contaminated objects. This is a very common one. You touch the handle of a door and you had some bacteria or viruses on your hand, and then somebody comes along and touches that same object. That's going to possibly be transmitted to you. So those are the 5 methods of transmission that humans can get illness.